There are names in history that arrive quietly, carried on the breath of rumor rather than fact. Names that seem to float between truth and imagination, suspended somewhere between what was lived and what was later told. Lucrezia Borgia is one of these names. For centuries she has been remembered as a poisoner, a conspirator, a symbol of Renaissance success. Paintings, operas, novels, and whispered legends shaped her into something almost mythological, a woman draped in silk and danger, surrounded by intrigue, her smile hiding hidden intentions. Yet when one moves gently through the surviving letters, the diplomatic reports, the records left by those who actually knew her, the image begins to soften. The edges blur. The story becomes quieter. And a question slowly emerges. What if the most famous poisoner in history never poisoned anyone at all? The Italy of the late 15th century was not yet a single country but a mosaic of competing powers, duchies, republics, kingdoms, and papal territories bound together by alliances that shifted like sand beneath the tide. Rome itself was both sacred and political, a city where spiritual authority intertwined with ambition, diplomacy, and survival. Within this world, lineage was destiny. Children born into powerful families were rarely allowed the luxury of private lives. Their futures were negotiated long before they could speak, their marriages decided before they understood the meaning of devotion. A daughter of a rising dynasty was not simply a child. She was a promise, a bridge between houses, a symbol that could reshape alliances. Lucrezia Borgia entered this world on April 18, 1480, in the town of Subiaco. Her father was Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, a man of immense charisma and formidable ambition. Born into a Spanish noble family that had risen within the Church, Rodrigo understood the mechanisms of power with almost instinctive clarity. He possessed wealth, influence, and a network of allies that extended across Europe. He also possessed something that would later shape Lucrezia's life profoundly: a willingness to blur the boundaries between sacred duty and personal ambition. Her mother, Venanza de Catania, lived in a different sphere. Practical, resilient, and deeply involved in managing her own affairs, she provided stability during Lucrezia's earliest years. Though Rodrigo acknowledged his children openly, unusual for a cardinal, their upbringing balanced between public acceptance and private negotiation. Lucrezia grew up alongside her brothers, Cesare, Giovanni, and Goffredo. Each child would eventually carry a different piece of the Borgia story, though at the time they were simply siblings moving through the rhythms of Renaissance childhood: tutors, gardens, long corridors filled with candlelight. Education was not neglected. On the contrary, Lucrezia received an unusually refined education for a girl of her time. She learned Latin and Italian, read poetry, studied music, and developed the courtly manners expected of a future noblewoman. Letters later written by ambassadors describe her as composed and articulate, someone able to listen attentively and respond with measured grace. Sarah Bradford would later write, "She was educated for power. But power, for a Borgia woman, meant only one thing: usefulness." The word usefulness, when viewed through the lens of Renaissance politics, carried weight. It meant being positioned carefully, moved strategically, and expected to serve purposes larger than oneself. Rome in the 1480s and 1490s was a city of contrasts. Marble churches stood beside bustling markets. Pilgrims walked alongside mercenaries. The scent of incense mingled with the sounds of political bargaining. For the Borgias, Rome was both home and stage. Rodrigo's ascent toward greater influence transformed the lives of his children. As his status grew, so too did the expectations placed upon them. Alliances became more urgent, negotiations more intricate. Every gesture was watched, every rumor recorded by foreign envoys eager to understand the shifting balance of power. Lucrezia, still very young, learned early how to move within this world, how to remain poised when observed, how to speak carefully, how to embody the image required of her. There are accounts describing her appearance: fair hair, pale skin, a calm expression that observers interpreted in different ways. Some saw innocence, others projected calculation. Yet these descriptions often reveal more about the observer than the subject. The Renaissance loved symbolism, and women of powerful families often became canvases upon which others painted their expectations and fears. In 1492, Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. The transformation was immediate. The cardinal's household became the papal court. The Borgias moved from influential nobles to one of the most powerful families in Europe almost overnight. For Lucrezia, who was only 12 years old, the change reshaped her future entirely. From that moment, she was no longer merely a noble daughter. She was the daughter of the Pope, a figure who would become both admired and deeply controversial. Power brought admiration, but it also invited resentment. Rival families watched closely, waiting for any opportunity to undermine the Borgias. Stories began to circulate, subtle at first, then louder. The seeds of what historians would later call the Black Legend were planted during these years, a mixture of political propaganda, moral judgment, and fascination with scandal. Lucrezia's name entered these stories long before she had any control over her own life. In 1493, at the age of 13, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. The marriage was not born of romance but diplomacy. The Sforza family controlled Milan, a crucial power in northern Italy. An alliance through marriage strengthened the Borgias' political position. Descriptions of the wedding emphasized splendor, silks, jewels, music echoing through vast halls, yet beneath the ceremony lay a quiet reality familiar to many Renaissance brides. She was a child stepping into a role designed by others. Ambassadors observed her carefully, reporting back to their courts. Her grace, her composure, her ability to navigate ceremonial expectations were noted with approval. At first, the alliance appeared stable. But alliances in Renaissance Italy rarely remained unchanged. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, political currents began to shift. The annulment of this marriage, years later, would become one of the first sparks fueling the myths surrounding Lucrezia Borgia. Rumors would flourish, accusations would multiply, and narratives would emerge that blurred fiction and truth until they were nearly indistinguishable. Yet at the beginning, she was simply a young woman adjusting to unfamiliar surroundings, learning the expectations of a new court, carrying with her the weight of a family whose ambitions shaped every step she took. The legend had not yet fully formed, but its shadow was already present. In the next movement of her life, alliances would fracture, loyalties would shift, and the quiet child of Subiaco would begin to understand that marriage, for her, would never belong to the realm of personal choice. The early years of Lucrezia's marriage to Giovanni Sforza unfolded within a delicate balance between ceremony and uncertainty. Renaissance marriages among powerful families were rarely private affairs. They were extensions of diplomacy, observed and interpreted by ambassadors whose reports traveled farther than any personal confession ever could. Each gesture between husband and wife was quietly examined for signs of alliance or tension, loyalty or distance. Giovanni Sforza was older, experienced in political maneuvering, and connected to one of the most influential dynasties of northern Italy. For a time, the union strengthened the Borgia's strategic position, linking Rome with Milan through bonds that seemed secure. Yet alliances in Renaissance Italy were rarely permanent. Power shifted with military campaigns, papal ambitions, and foreign intervention. The same marriage that once served as protection could quickly become an obstacle. Lucrezia, still in her adolescence, learned to navigate the expectations placed upon her. Letters written by contemporaries describe her as courteous and restrained, capable of maintaining composure even when surrounded by intense scrutiny. She listened more than she spoke, a quality that observers interpreted as modesty, though it may also have reflected caution. The daughter of a pope could not afford impulsiveness. Rome itself became a theater of constant movement. Diplomats arrived from Spain, France, and the Italian states, bringing news of wars and shifting alliances. Festivals and religious ceremonies coexisted with negotiations conducted behind closed doors. Within this environment, rumors traveled easily, and the Borgia name became a magnet for speculation. The election of Rodrigo as Pope Alexander VI intensified both admiration and hostility toward the family. Critics accused him of nepotism, of elevating his children through papal authority, and of reshaping the Vatican according to personal ambition. Whether these accusations reflected reality or political rivalry often depended on who told the story. For rival families seeking influence, discrediting the Borgias became a strategic act. Lucrezia, though young, became part of this narrative. Her beauty was described in poetic language, her presence noted at ceremonies, and her silence often filled by the imagination of observers. Renaissance chroniclers frequently shaped women into symbols rather than individuals, and Lucrezia's identity began to dissolve into the expectations projected upon her. At first, the marriage to Giovanni Sforza seemed calm, yet political circumstances changed when the Borgias shifted their alliances away from Milan. What had once been a valuable connection became inconvenient. Negotiations began quietly, suggesting that the union might be dissolved. For Giovanni, such a shift threatened both reputation and power, and resistance emerged. The process of annulment in Renaissance Europe required justification, and the arguments presented often revealed more about politics than personal truth. The claim eventually put forward suggested that the marriage had not been consummated, implying that it had never been fully valid in the eyes of the Church. Giovanni resisted fiercely, aware that such an accusation carried implications for his masculinity and social standing. What followed became one of the earliest moments in which Lucrezia's reputation began to transform into legend. Rumors spread rapidly across Italy, suggesting scandal where political maneuvering was the more likely cause. Stories appeared hinting at secret relationships, at impropriety within the papal family, at conspiracies whispered in corridors lit by candlelight. Modern historians often view these accusations as propaganda designed to undermine Alexander VI by attacking his daughter's honor. Maria Belanci would later observe that Lucrezia's supposed guilt exists not in the historical record but in the enduring human tendency to seek dramatic villains. For Lucrezia herself, the annulment marked a turning point. A marriage arranged for political necessity dissolved under equally political reasoning, leaving her position uncertain. She returned to Rome, where her father's authority offered protection but also increased visibility. The papal court observed her closely, and foreign ambassadors continued to report every development to their rulers. During this period, an episode emerged that would further complicate her historical image. While the annulment negotiations unfolded, Lucrezia stayed in a convent, a place of temporary retreat where she could remain away from the intense public gaze. Some later storytellers interpreted this retreat as evidence of scandal or secrecy, yet surviving documents suggest it was a practical decision, providing stability during a time of negotiation. It was also during these years that her administrative abilities began to appear. In 1499, she was appointed governor of Spoleto, an extraordinary role for a woman of her age. The appointment reflected both her father's trust and the necessity of reliable leadership within the papal territories. Reports from the period describe her governance as measured and effective, emphasizing order rather than spectacle. The role of governor placed her within the machinery of political authority rather than merely at its ceremonial edge. She listened to petitions, oversaw administration, and represented papal interests in a region requiring careful management. Such responsibilities challenged the later stereotype of Lucrezia as a passive figure or purely decorative presence. Instead, they suggest a young woman learning to navigate power through patience and diplomacy. Meanwhile, the stories surrounding her continued to grow, evolving independently from her lived experience. The distance between reality and reputation widened, creating a dual identity that would follow her for the rest of her life. One version of Lucrezia existed within documents and letters, while another existed within rumor and imagination. As the annulment from Giovanni Sforza was finalized in 1497, the alliance between the Borgias and Milan ended. For Lucrezia, the conclusion of her first marriage did not bring freedom, but rather preparation for another arrangement, another negotiation shaped by the ambitions of powerful men. Renaissance daughters rarely remained unmarried for long, especially when their families' influence depended on strategic alliances. Plans for her future began almost immediately, guided by political necessity rather than personal inclination. And within these plans, a new figure would soon appear, one whose presence would transform her life in ways both tender and tragic. The end of Lucrezia's first marriage did not bring stillness. Renaissance courts rarely allowed silence to linger, especially when political advantage depended on swift movement. As negotiations surrounding the annulment concluded, attention immediately turned toward her future, and with it toward the next alliance that might strengthen the Borgia position within the shifting landscape of Italian politics. At this moment, Italy existed under the shadow of larger powers. France pressed into the peninsula with military ambition, Spanish influence extended through dynastic ties, and local rulers maneuvered carefully between loyalty and survival. Marriage became one of the most refined instruments of diplomacy, quieter than armies yet capable of reshaping alliances just as profoundly. Lucrezia, still in her late teens, became the center of new negotiations. Reports from ambassadors described discussions carried out with careful calculation, as though arranging pieces upon a chessboard whose outcome remained uncertain. Yet behind these negotiations was a young woman whose personal desires were rarely recorded, her voice largely absent from the documents that survive. Her second marriage, arranged in 1498, connected her to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Biceglie, the illegitimate son of King Alfonso II of Naples. Unlike her first union, which had been purely strategic, this marriage appears to have held elements of genuine affection. Contemporary sources suggest a warmth between them that observers noticed, a softness within the otherwise rigid structure of political expectation. Alfonso was described as gentle, refined, and attentive. For Lucrezia, whose previous marriage had been shaped by negotiation and eventual conflict, this new relationship may have offered a rare sense of companionship. Letters and reports hint at moments of shared intimacy, small gestures that humanize figures often reduced to symbols by later history. Rome during this period vibrated with tension and opportunity. Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother, began to emerge as a central figure within the family's ambitions. Having renounced his cardinalship to pursue military leadership, he sought to build a territorial state through conquest and alliance. His actions, bold and sometimes ruthless, intensified both admiration and fear among contemporaries. Within this environment, Lucrezia's marriage to Alfonso of Aragon symbolized alignment with the Kingdom of Naples, a relationship that initially strengthened Borgia influence. Celebrations marked the union, and observers noted the apparent harmony between bride and groom. For a brief period, the atmosphere surrounding her seemed calmer, almost hopeful. In 1499, Lucrezia gave birth to a son, Rodrigo of Aragon. Motherhood introduced a new dimension to her life, one less documented by political observers yet deeply significant. Renaissance motherhood carried both joy and danger, as childbirth remained unpredictable and often perilous. Surviving accounts describe her devotion to her child, suggesting that within the structured world of court life she found moments of private tenderness. Yet alliances rarely remained stable for long. Political winds shifted again as French power expanded across Italy, altering the balance between Naples and the Borgias. The same marriage that had once strengthened connections became politically inconvenient. Alfonso of Aragon, now linked to a weakening alliance, found himself increasingly vulnerable. Ambassadors began to report signs of tension. Alfonso reportedly sensed danger and withdrew at times from the papal court, uncertain of his position within the evolving political landscape. Whether his fears were justified or influenced by rumor remains difficult to determine, but the atmosphere surrounding him grew increasingly uncertain. The transformation from alliance to liability unfolded gradually, almost invisibly at first. In Renaissance politics, such transitions often occurred behind closed doors, revealed only through subtle changes in behavior or the tone of diplomatic correspondence. Those watching closely may have sensed this shift long before events reached their tragic conclusion. One evening in July 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He survived the initial assault, wounded but alive, and was taken back to the Vatican for recovery. Accounts describe Lucrezia remaining at his side, caring for him during his convalescence, refusing to leave even when advised to rest. The details of what followed remain among the most debated aspects of her life. Alfonso was eventually killed, allegedly strangled while recovering from his injuries. Many historians suspect the involvement of Cesare Borgia, whose political ambitions may have viewed the Neapolitan alliance as an obstacle. Yet no definitive proof survives, only reports shaped by perspective and rumor. For Lucrezia, the loss of her husband marked a profound rupture. Whether she possessed knowledge of the political forces surrounding his death remains unknown. What can be traced through surviving documents is the shift in tone surrounding her life. The image of the grieving widow began to coexist with growing rumors portraying her as complicit in dark intrigues. It is here that the black legend gained momentum. Stories circulated suggesting poison rings, secret plots, and hidden crimes, transforming personal tragedy into spectacle. Rival families and hostile chroniclers amplified these narratives, shaping public perception in ways that would echo for centuries. Yet when historians examine primary sources, they often encounter silence where later storytellers inserted drama. The absence of clear evidence contrasts sharply with the vivid myths that developed afterward. Lucrezia's reality during this time appears quieter and more complex. She mourned, cared for her child, and continued to fulfill the roles expected of her within the papal court. The distance between lived experience and public narrative widened further, creating a shadow that followed her into every subsequent chapter of her life. Soon, another marriage would be arranged, one that would carry her away from Rome entirely and reshape her identity once more. The death of Alfonso of Aragon marked the end of a brief period in which Lucrezia's life had seemed almost settled. In the aftermath, Rome returned to its familiar rhythm of ceremonies, negotiations, and whispered conversations carried through marble halls. Grief, in Renaissance courts, rarely allowed long retreat. Personal sorrow was expected to fold quietly into public duty. Lucrezia remained within the orbit of her family, surrounded by the ambitions and uncertainties that defined the Borgia household. Her brother Cesare continued his campaigns, expanding influence through alliances and military strategy. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, governed a papacy both admired for its political strength and criticized for its perceived excesses. Within this environment, every movement of the Pope's daughter was observed with heightened curiosity. It was during this period that her reputation began to diverge sharply from the reality suggested by diplomatic correspondence. Chroniclers hostile to the Borgias portrayed her as central to intrigue, attributing motives and actions that lack clear support in contemporary documents. The idea of Lucrezia as a dangerous woman proved irresistible to audiences fascinated by the combination of power, beauty, and scandal. Yet behind these stories was a young widow navigating loss within a world that rarely acknowledged vulnerability. Surviving letters and reports suggest she withdrew into quieter routines for a time, participating in religious observances and maintaining the composure expected of her position. Such moments rarely appear in dramatic retellings, yet they form an essential part of understanding her lived experience. As political realities shifted once again, discussions began regarding her third marriage. This union would be perhaps the most significant of her life, not only because it would last longer than the others, but because it would carry her into a new environment where she would gradually establish an identity separate from the Vatican. The proposed groom was Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. The Este family represented a powerful northern dynasty known for its cultural sophistication and political stability. For the Borgias, the marriage offered strategic advantage and legitimacy among Italian nobility. For the Este family, the alliance promised connection to papal authority, though not without hesitation. Negotiations proved complex. The reputation surrounding the Borgias caused concern among members of the Este court, particularly regarding the rumors that had begun to define Lucrezia's public image. Correspondence between ambassadors reveals careful questioning, requests for assurances, and debates over whether the alliance would enhance or endanger Ferrara's position. Dowry discussions extended over months, reflecting both economic and political calculation. Pope Alexander VI offered significant concessions, demonstrating the importance he placed on securing this marriage. Eventually, agreement was reached, and preparations began for Lucrezia's departure from Rome. Her journey north in 1502 represented more than a physical relocation. It marked a transition from the environment that had shaped her early life into a new court where she would be both outsider and duchess-in-waiting. Contemporary descriptions of her departure speak of elaborate ceremonies, gifts, and processions designed to signal prestige and stability. Observers recorded her clothing, her attendants, the splendor of the convoy that accompanied her. Yet beneath the spectacle lay uncertainty. Ferrara's court awaited her arrival with curiosity mixed with skepticism, influenced by the rumors that had already traveled ahead of her. The journey itself unfolded slowly, allowing time for reflection. Traveling through the Italian countryside, passing fortified cities and quiet villages, Lucrezia moved away from the Vatican's intense atmosphere toward a different rhythm of life. The landscapes she crossed reflected the diversity of Renaissance Italy: fertile plains, rivers winding through cultivated fields, towers rising above medieval streets. When she approached Ferrara, anticipation filled the city. Alfonso d'Este, known for his pragmatic temperament and interest in art and engineering, prepared to receive a bride whose reputation preceded her. Accounts describe the initial meeting as formal and restrained, shaped by mutual caution rather than immediate intimacy. For Lucrezia, the arrival marked another beginning shaped by obligation rather than personal choice. Yet unlike her earlier marriages, this union would provide space for gradual transformation. Away from Rome's constant scrutiny, she would begin to redefine her role, not merely as a political instrument but as a participant in the cultural and administrative life of a thriving duchy. The early days in Ferrara required adjustment. Court customs differed, expectations shifted, and relationships had to be built carefully. Some members of the Este family remained wary, influenced by the stories surrounding her past. Others observed quietly, waiting to see whether the rumors aligned with reality. As weeks passed, reports began to change tone. Ambassadors described her courtesy, her attention to ceremony, and her ability to adapt to the new environment with measured grace. Gradually, skepticism softened into cautious acceptance. The transformation was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like the slow adjustment of eyes to changing light. Without fanfare, a new chapter of Lucrezia's life began to unfold, one that would challenge the narratives already written about her and reveal dimensions rarely captured by legend. The early months of Lucrezia's life in Ferrara unfolded with careful observation from all sides. The Este court, known for its refinement and cultural ambition, valued stability and reputation, and many within it had greeted news of the Borgia marriage with hesitation. Stories carried northward from Rome had already shaped expectations, and Lucrezia arrived not simply as a bride but as a figure surrounded by narrative. Ferrara itself offered a contrast to the Vatican. Where Rome had been dense with religious symbolism and constant political intrigue, Ferrara presented a quieter elegance. Its streets were orderly, its court deeply invested in music, poetry, and intellectual exchange. The Este family had cultivated an environment in which artists and scholars found patronage, creating a city that balanced power with culture. At first, Lucrezia moved cautiously within this new world. Etiquette required observation before action, and she spent time learning the rhythms of court life, the preferences of her husband, and the expectations of his family. Reports from ambassadors note her attentiveness to ceremony and her ability to maintain dignity even when faced with subtle skepticism. Alfonso d'Este himself was described as pragmatic, reserved, and deeply engaged with matters of governance and innovation. Unlike the romanticized figures often imagined in Renaissance narratives, he approached marriage with a sense of duty. Their relationship developed slowly, shaped less by dramatic affection than by mutual respect and shared responsibility. Gradually, Lucrezia's presence began to reshape perceptions. She participated in courtly events with grace, supported artistic endeavors, and demonstrated an ability to balance formality with warmth. Musicians, poets, and visitors described gatherings in which she hosted conversations marked by intelligence rather than spectacle. Such descriptions contrast sharply with later portrayals of her as solely an instrument of intrigue. One of the most significant changes during this period was the emergence of her role as patron. Renaissance courts often relied on noblewomen to cultivate cultural life, and Lucrezia embraced this responsibility. She supported writers and artists, corresponded with intellectuals, and contributed to the flourishing atmosphere that defined Ferrara during the early 16th century. Yet even as her reputation within Ferrara improved, the shadow of Rome lingered. Visitors arriving from other courts carried stories shaped by political rivalry, and whispers occasionally resurfaced, questioning her past. Rather than confronting these rumors directly, she responded through consistent behavior, allowing time and presence to gradually alter perception. Motherhood remained central to her life. Over the years, she experienced multiple pregnancies, each bringing both hope and risk. Renaissance childbirth demanded resilience, and the emotional weight of motherhood existed alongside the responsibilities of court life. Some of her children would not survive infancy, a common tragedy of the era that rarely appears in historical summaries yet deeply shaped personal experience. Among her surviving children were Ercole II, who would later inherit the duchy, Ippolito II, who pursued an ecclesiastical career, Eleonora, and Francesco. Through motherhood, Lucrezia's identity expanded beyond political alliance, grounding her in the rhythms of family life even while she continued to represent ducal authority. Observers began to note changes in her demeanor. Where earlier descriptions emphasized youthful beauty or speculation about scandal, later accounts focused on composure, maturity, and intelligence. The transformation did not occur suddenly but emerged through years of consistent presence, revealing a figure more complex than the legend that followed her. Meanwhile, events beyond Ferrara continued to shape her emotional landscape. News from Rome carried updates about her father's policies and her brother Cesare's campaigns, reminding her that the world she had left behind remained active and unpredictable. The distance offered safety, yet it also created a quiet separation from the family that had defined her early life. The court of Ferrara increasingly became her domain, a space where she could exercise influence not through overt power but through diplomacy, patronage, and the cultivation of relationships. This quieter form of authority contrasted with the dramatic narratives often associated with the Borgias, suggesting a different interpretation of strength. As years passed, the image of Lucrezia within Ferrara evolved from outsider to respected duchess. Those who interacted with her regularly described kindness balanced with discipline, elegance without extravagance, and a capacity for listening that encouraged trust. The legend of the poisoner continued to circulate beyond the city's walls, yet within Ferrara a different story gradually took root, one shaped not by rumor but by lived experience. And as she settled into this new role, the turbulence of her earlier life seemed to recede slightly, replaced by a rhythm defined by governance, family, and the quiet passage of time. Life in Ferrara moved with a steadier rhythm than the shifting intensity of Rome, yet beneath its calm surface remained the quiet complexity of Renaissance politics. Lucrezia learned to inhabit this rhythm gradually, adjusting her presence to the expectations of a court that valued restraint and continuity. Over time, observers began to notice a subtle confidence emerging in her conduct, a composure shaped by experience rather than youth. Her role expanded beyond ceremonial appearances. While Alfonso X focused on military matters, engineering projects, and territorial concerns, Lucrezia became an important presence within the internal life of the court. She oversaw correspondence, received visitors, and occasionally acted as intermediary between factions whose disagreements required careful handling. Such tasks demanded patience and emotional intelligence, qualities rarely acknowledged in dramatic retellings yet essential to maintaining stability. The transformation in how she was perceived did not occur without resistance. Some members of the Este court remained cautious, influenced by stories that continued to circulate about the Borgias. Yet time possesses a quiet authority, and daily interaction began to replace rumor with familiarity. Servants, musicians, and visiting envoys described her attentiveness to detail, her willingness to listen, and the calm atmosphere she cultivated around her. Festivals and cultural gatherings played an important role in Ferrara's identity, and Lucrezia participated in shaping these events. Music filled the halls during evening gatherings, poetry readings created moments of reflection, and artists found encouragement under her patronage. These activities were not merely decorative. They reinforced the prestige of the duchy and demonstrated its alignment with Renaissance ideals of refinement and intellectual engagement. Correspondence from this period reveals her growing involvement in cultural networks extending beyond Ferrara. She exchanged letters with writers and thinkers, contributing to conversations that bridged courts across Italy. Such exchanges illustrate a woman engaged intellectually with her world, contradicting later portrayals that reduced her to a passive figure within male-dominated politics. Motherhood continued to shape her days. Each pregnancy brought both anticipation and vulnerability, reminding her of the fragile boundary between life and loss. The survival of her children offered moments of profound relief. Yet the memory of earlier tragedies remained present, a quiet undercurrent within her personal experience. Meanwhile, events in Rome began to shift dramatically. Pope Alexander VI's authority faced increasing challenges, and Cesare Borgia's ambitions drew both admiration and opposition. Reports reaching Ferrara carried news of victories and tensions, reminding Lucrezia that her family's fate remained uncertain despite the physical distance between them. The contrast between her life in Ferrara and the turbulence associated with the Borgias became increasingly pronounced. Visitors often remarked upon the serenity of her household, describing a duchess who appeared dedicated to harmony rather than conflict. Whether this serenity reflected personal inclination or strategic adaptation remains open to interpretation, yet it contributed to the gradual reshaping of her image among those who encountered her directly. Historians such as Christopher Hibbert later emphasized this phase of her life as evidence that Lucrezia's historical reputation diverged significantly from contemporary accounts within Ferrara. Where legend imagined intrigue, local observers described stability. Where rumor suggested danger, daily life revealed routine. The years following her arrival allowed her to build something rare within Renaissance politics: continuity. Unlike her earlier marriages, which had been defined by sudden shifts and abrupt endings, this period offered time to develop relationships, refine her role, and establish a sense of belonging. Yet history rarely allows calm to remain uninterrupted. News from Rome would soon arrive carrying the weight of loss, altering not only her personal world but also the political landscape that had shaped her life from childhood. And as the echoes of that news reached Ferrara, the distance between Lucrezia and her past would begin to transform into something quieter, more reflective, as though she were slowly stepping away from the story others had written for her. News from Rome traveled slowly but carried immense weight when it arrived. Letters sealed with wax crossed long distances through uncertain roads, passing from courier to courier until they reached the courts that waited in quiet anticipation. For Lucrezia in Ferrara, each message from the south carried an echo of the life she had left behind, reminding her that distance did not erase connection. In August 1503, word came that Pope Alexander VI had fallen ill. Illness within the Renaissance papacy always stirred anxiety, for the death of a pope did not simply mark personal loss but triggered profound political transformation. Alliances shifted, protections vanished, and those whose power depended on papal favor often found themselves suddenly vulnerable. When Alexander VI died later that month, the news reshaped the world that had defined Lucrezia's early life. Her father, whose ambition and charisma had elevated the Borgia family to extraordinary prominence, was gone. For many across Europe, his death marked the end of a controversial era. For Lucrezia, it represented the loss of a central figure whose authority had structured her destiny since childhood. Reports from contemporaries describe her reaction as restrained yet deeply felt. Renaissance noblewomen were expected to express grief through ritual rather than open display, and she fulfilled these expectations while maintaining the composure required of a duchess. Yet beneath formal mourning lay the quiet recognition that the protective sphere surrounding her had changed irrevocably. The death of Alexander VI also altered the position of Cesare Borgia. Without papal support, his military achievements and political ambitions faced new challenges. Rivals who had once approached him with caution now sensed opportunity. The rapid transformation of his fortunes demonstrated the fragile nature of Renaissance power, where authority could vanish as quickly as it had risen. For Lucrezia, these developments created a complex emotional landscape. She remained physically distant from the turmoil, yet emotionally connected to the unfolding events. Letters exchanged during this period suggest concern for her brother's fate, reflecting the deep bond between siblings whose lives had been intertwined since childhood. Within Ferrara, the reaction to these events was measured. The Este court observed carefully, aware that the fall of Borgia influence might alter regional dynamics. Some may have felt relief, given earlier hesitation regarding the alliance, yet outwardly the court maintained dignity, supporting Lucrezia through a period of transition. As months passed, news continued to arrive describing Cesare's struggles. Political alliances unraveled, territories once secured through force slipped from his control, and the narrative surrounding the Borgias shifted rapidly from fear to vulnerability. For historians, this period illustrates how quickly reputation could change when power diminished. Lucrezia's own position, however, remained stable. Her marriage to Alfonso X provided continuity independent of papal authority, allowing her to maintain status within a court that valued her presence. This stability offered a contrast to the turbulence affecting her family elsewhere. Observers noted that during this time she increasingly turned toward religious practice. Participation in devotional rituals, charitable activities, and correspondence with religious figures suggests a growing spiritual dimension within her life. Whether this represented personal inclination or response to loss remains uncertain, yet it contributed to the evolving perception of her character. The distance between legend and lived reality widened further. While some chroniclers continued to portray her through the lens of scandal associated with her father's papacy, those interacting with her daily described a duchess marked by composure and generosity. The dual narrative persisted, reflecting the broader human tendency to preserve dramatic myths even when contradicted by quieter truths. As Cesari's fortunes declined, Lucrezia's life in Ferrara entered a period defined less by dramatic upheaval and more by gradual maturation. She embraced responsibilities connected to governance, family, and cultural patronage, shaping an identity that stood increasingly independent from the stories surrounding her youth. Yet memory has its own rhythm. The past did not disappear simply because she moved away from Rome. It lingered in the way visitors looked at her, in the questions left unspoken, in the assumptions that traveled ahead of her name. And within that space between past and present, Lucrezia continued to build a life defined not by spectacle but by continuity, creating a quiet legacy that would only become fully visible when viewed from the distance of centuries. The years following the death of Alexander VI unfolded with a sense of gradual transition rather than sudden change. For Lucrezia, life in Ferrara continued to deepen into routine, shaped by seasons, ceremonies, and the quiet responsibilities that accompanied her role as duchess. The turbulence associated with the Borgia name did not disappear, yet its intensity softened as distance and time reshaped perspective. The Este court valued continuity and refinement, and Lucrezia increasingly became a stabilizing presence within its structure. Her household reflected careful organization, blending Spanish influences from her upbringing with the cultural traditions of northern Italy. Visitors described an atmosphere of elegance marked not by excess but by harmony, where music and conversation flowed easily and where intellectual curiosity was encouraged. Cultural patronage formed an essential part of her identity during this period. Ferrara was known for its artistic life, and under her influence the court hosted poets, musicians, and scholars whose work contributed to the broader Renaissance movement. Gatherings often included readings of new compositions, discussions of classical texts, and performances that transformed evenings into moments of shared reflection. Such activities allowed Lucrezia to shape her environment through creativity rather than overt political authority. Renaissance noblewomen frequently exercised influence in this indirect manner, cultivating spaces where ideas could flourish. Letters from artists and writers reveal appreciation for her support, suggesting that she understood the importance of fostering beauty and thought within a world often defined by conflict. Motherhood continued to anchor her daily life. The care of children introduced rhythms that contrasted with the unpredictability of court politics. Lessons with tutors, walks through gardens, and moments of quiet domestic routine offered glimpses of a life less dominated by diplomacy. These experiences rarely appear in historical narratives focused on power, yet they formed the texture of her existence. At the same time, her administrative role expanded subtly. Alfonso d'Este occasionally entrusted her with responsibilities during his absences, allowing her to oversee aspects of governance. Surviving correspondence indicates that she managed petitions, communicated with officials, and maintained order within the ducal household. Such tasks required patience and attention, reinforcing the impression that she possessed practical skills beyond ceremonial duties. Observers from foreign courts began to revise earlier assumptions about her character. Diplomatic reports described her as intelligent, measured, and capable of maintaining equilibrium among competing interests. This shift in perception illustrates how lived experience gradually reshaped reputation, though it did not entirely erase the myths that continued to circulate elsewhere. The contrast between external legend and internal reality remained striking. In distant courts, stories about poison and intrigue persisted, fueled by fascination with the Borgias. Within Ferrara, however, the narrative centered on stability and cultural refinement. The coexistence of these two images reveals how historical figures often become divided between myth and memory. As years passed, Lucrezia's marriage to Alfonso d'Este evolved into a partnership characterized by mutual respect. While the intensity of romantic affection described in her earlier marriage to Alfonso of Aragon may not have been present in the same form, their relationship demonstrated durability. Shared responsibilities and the passage of time created a bond grounded in cooperation and familiarity. Religious devotion continued to shape her personal world. She participated in charitable works, supported convents, and maintained correspondence with spiritual advisors. These activities reflected broader Renaissance patterns, in which noblewomen balanced worldly responsibilities with spiritual reflection. Some historians interpret this devotion as evidence of inner transformation following earlier losses, though definitive conclusions remain elusive. Meanwhile, Europe itself continued to change. Political alliances shifted, wars altered borders, and the Renaissance advanced through art and scholarship. Ferrara remained a vibrant center within this landscape, and Lucrezia's presence contributed to its cultural identity. In quieter moments, one might imagine her reflecting upon the distance between the young girl married at 13 and the duchess she had become. Experience had refined her understanding of power, revealing that influence often existed not in dramatic gestures but in steady presence, in the cultivation of trust over time. The legend of the poisoner lingered beyond the walls of Ferrara, yet within those walls another story unfolded, one defined by patience, resilience, and the gradual reshaping of identity. As the first decade of the 16th century moved forward, Lucrezia's life in Ferrara settled into a pattern that blended ceremonial duty with quiet personal rhythms. The city itself seemed to breathe at a slower pace than Rome, its streets shaped by long traditions rather than sudden political storms. Bells marked the passing of hours, markets opened with predictable regularity, and the ducal palace became both residence and symbol of continuity. Within this environment, Lucrezia's role continued to evolve. She was no longer simply the daughter of a controversial pope or the widow of a murdered prince. She had become an integral part of the Este court's identity. Visitors increasingly described her not through the lens of scandal but through observations of grace, intelligence, and presence. Such descriptions suggest that daily interaction gradually replaced rumor with lived experience. Her patronage of the arts expanded during these years. Ferrara's musicians composed new works for court celebrations, poets dedicated verses to the Duchess, and artists found encouragement under her protection. The Renaissance belief in harmony between beauty and intellect shaped these gatherings, creating spaces where creativity flourished alongside political conversation. Evenings at court often unfolded with quiet elegance. Candles illuminated tapestries depicting mythological scenes. Lutes and viols filled halls with soft music, and conversations moved between philosophy, poetry, and news from distant courts. Lucrezia's role as host required attentiveness to detail, ensuring that guests felt welcomed while maintaining the dignity of the ducal household. Yet beneath this atmosphere of refinement lay the realities of governance. Ferrara faced challenges common to Renaissance states: economic pressures, diplomatic negotiations, and the constant need to maintain alliances. During periods when Alfonso d'Este traveled or focused on military concerns, Lucrezia occasionally assumed responsibilities that required decisive judgment. Letters from officials indicate that she managed disputes, responded to petitions, and maintained communication with neighboring territories. Such responsibilities challenge the simplistic narrative that portrays her solely as a passive figure shaped by others. Instead, they reveal a woman capable of navigating complex structures with patience and strategic awareness. Sarah Bradford later observed that Lucrezia had been educated for power, though power for a Borgia woman often meant usefulness within the ambitions of others. In Ferrara, however, usefulness transformed gradually into agency. Motherhood remained a central aspect of her identity. Watching her children grow introduced new dimensions of hope and concern. Tutors guided their education in languages, religion, and courtly behavior, preparing them for futures shaped by the same expectations that had defined her youth. Moments spent with them may have offered glimpses of a quieter life beyond political calculation, though such moments rarely appear in official records. Religious devotion continued to deepen. She supported monasteries, contributed to charitable initiatives, and maintained a relationship with spiritual advisors who offered guidance during times of reflection. Renaissance spirituality often blended ritual with personal contemplation, and Lucrezia's involvement in religious life suggests an inward dimension rarely acknowledged by those who preferred sensational interpretations of her character. Meanwhile, the narrative surrounding the Borgias outside Ferrara continued to evolve. Chroniclers shaped stories to suit political agendas, reinforcing the image of a family defined by excess and intrigue. These narratives rarely incorporated the quieter realities of Lucrezia's daily life, revealing how historical memory often favors drama over nuance. The contrast between these two versions of her identity created a silent tension. Within Ferrara she was known through presence. Beyond it she existed as legend. Over time, this distance between reality and reputation would become one of the most defining aspects of her historical legacy. As seasons passed and years accumulated, Lucrezia's life entered a phase marked by stability. The intensity of her early experiences softened into routine, allowing space for growth and reflection. The young girl shaped by Vatican politics had become a duchess whose influence emerged through steadiness rather than spectacle. And within this quiet continuity, the foundations of her lasting legacy began to take form, unnoticed perhaps by those living beside her, yet destined to reshape how future generations would reconsider the story told about her name. By the second decade of the 16th century, Lucrezia's identity in Ferrara had become increasingly rooted in stability and measured presence. The daily rhythm of court life, once strange and foreign, now unfolded with familiarity. She understood the patterns of audience, ceremony, and administration, and she moved through these duties with a composure that suggested experience rather than mere formality. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, while arranged and political in origin, had settled into a partnership defined by mutual respect and practical cooperation. Affection, though quiet, emerged through shared responsibilities, attention to household affairs, and the collective management of family and court. Their relationship exemplified a Renaissance model of partnership where survival, social expectation, and duty intertwined. Within the palace, Lucrezia cultivated spaces that reflected refinement and intellectual engagement. Libraries and music rooms became venues for thoughtful exchange, while gardens offered both aesthetic pleasure and quiet retreat. Courtiers and visiting dignitaries noted her ability to host with dignity, encouraging conversation that balanced entertainment, learning, and decorum. Cultural patronage flourished under her guidance. She commissioned manuscripts, supported painters, and encouraged composers, understanding that art served both beauty and diplomacy. These acts reinforced her presence and influence without requiring overt political maneuvering, demonstrating that Renaissance power could be exercised through cultivation and taste. Motherhood continued to shape her experience of time. Her children grew under careful instruction, prepared for futures that reflected both Borgia legacy and Este opportunity. Ercole II, Ippolito II, Eleonora, and Francesco benefited from tutors who emphasized languages, history, and the arts, while Lucrezia herself modeled comportment, patience, and measured judgment. Yet even as domestic and cultural life flourished, news from Rome persisted. The decline of Cesare Borgia's fortunes and the shifting papacy reminded her that the world she had left remained in motion. Letters conveyed victories, defeats, and political maneuvers that, while distant, could influence alliances and reputation in subtle ways. The contrast between Ferrara's calm and Rome's turbulence reinforced her awareness of the fragility of public perception. She had lived through the creation of the Black Legend, experienced its consequences, and now occupied a space where her actions could quietly reshape her image. Time, careful behavior, and consistent presence began to work as a counterbalance to rumor and myth. Religious devotion continued to provide structure and reflection. Attendance at Mass, charitable activity, and correspondence with spiritual advisors offered continuity, grounding her life in principles that transcended the shifting tides of court intrigue. These practices were personal yet observable, contributing to her reputation as thoughtful and measured rather than sensational. Observers who recorded their impressions emphasized subtle qualities: a gaze attentive without intrusion, speech measured without artifice, gestures precise yet gentle. Such details reveal a woman who learned to navigate a world in which every action might be interpreted and misinterpreted, and who chose a path of steady composure. Over the years, Lucrezia's presence became integral to the identity of Ferrara itself. The court's reputation for refinement, cultural engagement, and measured diplomacy owed as much to her influence as to any single political act. Where Rome had seen legend, Ferrara witnessed lived reality, creating a duality that would define her historical image for centuries. The lessons of her youth, observation, patience, adaptation, found full expression in this environment. She no longer needed to prove herself as she had in early marriages, yet she continued to act with awareness, understanding that stability itself could be a form of power. And within the quiet, daily unfolding of life in Ferrara, Lucrezia's story began to reflect not the drama of rumor but the enduring rhythm of survival, adaptation, and presence, laying the groundwork for the later years that would combine personal loss, maternal responsibility, and legacy. Time in Ferrara seemed to move like a slow river, carrying with it both continuity and change. Seasons marked the passing years more clearly than political events, and within this steady rhythm Lucrezia's role deepened into something quieter and more grounded. The young bride who had arrived under scrutiny gradually became a figure associated with stability, her presence woven into the daily life of the court. Morning routines often began with religious observance. The soft echo of prayer within chapel walls created a transition from private reflection to public responsibility. Religion in the Renaissance was not separate from governance but intertwined with it, shaping decisions and offering a framework through which individuals understood suffering, duty, and hope. After prayer came audiences and correspondence. Letters arrived from neighboring courts, from relatives, from artists seeking patronage or guidance. Lucrezia read and responded with care, understanding that written words carried weight beyond the moment of their creation. Her handwriting, described by some observers as elegant and precise, reflected the education she had received in childhood, an education designed to prepare her for roles she could not yet have imagined. The court of Ferrara remained a center of artistic innovation. Painters experimented with perspective and color, musicians explored new forms of harmony, and poets composed verses that blended classical themes with contemporary experience. Lucrezia's patronage allowed these developments to flourish, reinforcing the duchy's reputation as a place where culture and governance existed in balance. Festivals punctuated the year, transforming the city into a space of shared celebration. Processions moved through streets lined with spectators, costumes shimmered in candlelight, and theatrical performances blurred the boundary between myth and reality. These events were more than entertainment. They demonstrated wealth, unity, and prestige, reinforcing the authority of the ruling family. Lucrezia's involvement in planning and hosting such occasions highlighted her ability to merge aesthetic vision with political awareness. Despite this outward harmony, personal loss continued to shape her inner world. The memory of earlier tragedies, including the death of Alfonso of Aragon, lingered quietly beneath the surface of daily life. Grief in Renaissance society often remained private, expressed through prayer, patronage, and acts of charity rather than open declaration. Her relationship with Alfonso d'Este matured through shared experience. Over time, mutual reliance replaced initial caution, allowing a partnership rooted in respect. They navigated challenges together, balancing the demands of governance with the complexities of family life. Letters exchanged between them during periods of separation suggest a tone of trust and collaboration rather than dramatic sentiment. Meanwhile, the broader political landscape continued to shift. News of conflicts and alliances reached Ferrara regularly, reminding the court that stability was never permanent. Yet Lucrezia's life remained relatively insulated from the sudden upheavals that had characterized her earlier years, offering space for reflection and growth. Ambassadors visiting Ferrara recorded impressions that contrasted sharply with earlier depictions of her. Rather than intrigue or excess, they described moderation and dignity. These accounts illustrate how proximity often alters perception, revealing nuances that distant observers overlook. The Black Legend persisted nonetheless. Stories written by rivals or later chroniclers painted vivid images of poison and manipulation, reinforcing a narrative that proved difficult to displace. The endurance of these myths demonstrates how historical memory often favors drama over subtlety, choosing stories that capture imagination even when unsupported by evidence. Within Ferrara, however, a different memory took root. Servants remembered kindness, artists recalled encouragement, and officials described competence. This local reputation, grounded in daily experience, offers an alternative lens through which to view her life. As the years passed, Lucrezia's identity became less defined by her past and more by her presence in the present. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible, yet profound. She had moved from being a figure shaped by others' ambitions to someone who shaped her environment through quiet influence. And as this period of maturity unfolded, new challenges approached slowly, carried by time itself, bringing with them both fulfillment and the inevitability of change that accompanies every human story. There are moments in a life when transformation does not arrive as a sudden event, but as a gradual deepening, almost imperceptible, while it is happening. By the early years of the 16th century, Lucrezia Borgia's presence in Ferrara had settled into such a transformation. The restless currents that had once carried her from alliance to alliance began to slow, replaced by a steadier rhythm shaped by responsibility, motherhood, and the quiet accumulation of trust. Observers who had arrived expecting scandal often departed with descriptions that sounded surprisingly calm. They wrote of a duchess who listened carefully, who spoke without haste, and who cultivated an atmosphere in which conversation unfolded naturally rather than competitively. Such impressions did not erase the myths circulating beyond Ferrara, yet they introduced a counterpoint, a quieter narrative grounded in direct experience. The court itself continued to flourish culturally. Ferrara's reputation as a center of music and poetry expanded during these years, and Lucrezia became increasingly associated with its refinement. Musicians performed compositions that moved gently through the halls during evening gatherings, and poets dedicated verses that described not intrigue but serenity. Whether these portrayals reflected artistic idealization or genuine admiration remains open to interpretation, yet their tone contrasts sharply with the darker legends that would later define her public memory. Christopher Hibbert would later note that the Ferrara years reveal a woman who functioned effectively within a structured political environment, balancing ceremonial expectations with practical involvement in governance. While her husband Alfonso d'Este remained the formal authority, Lucrezia's role as intermediary between courtiers and visitors allowed her to influence decisions through diplomacy rather than command. Such influence required patience. Renaissance courts were ecosystems of ambition, populated by individuals seeking favor or advancement. Managing these dynamics demanded an ability to sense tension before it became visible, to redirect conversation gently, and to preserve harmony without overt confrontation. Letters from ambassadors suggest that she excelled in this quiet form of negotiation. Meanwhile, motherhood continued to define her personal world. The presence of children within the palace introduced a different rhythm. Lessons with tutors, the sounds of laughter echoing through corridors, and moments of vulnerability rarely recorded in official documents. Each child represented both hope and responsibility, linking her future to that of the Este dynasty in ways that extended beyond political alliance. The contrast between her earlier life and her present reality grew increasingly pronounced. In Rome, her identity had been shaped largely by proximity to power. In Ferrara, it emerged through continuity and daily interaction. The young girl once positioned as a symbol of papal ambition gradually became a figure associated with stability. Yet the past did not entirely release its hold. Visitors occasionally arrived carrying stories colored by hostility toward the Borgias, repeating rumors that had circulated for years. Rather than attempting to correct these narratives directly, Lucrezia appeared to rely on presence and consistency, allowing time to challenge assumption. Maria Belanci would later write that Lucrezia's supposed guilt exists less in documented actions than in the enduring human need for dramatic figures. Within Ferrara, where observation replaced imagination, the dramatic figure seemed to dissolve into a more complex human reality. Season by season, her identity continued to evolve. Religious devotion deepened, expressed through patronage of charitable works and participation in spiritual practices that offered both structure and solace. Some historians interpret this devotion as a response to earlier losses, suggesting that faith provided continuity where political life had often offered only instability. As the years unfolded, the distance between legend and lived experience widened further. Outside Ferrara, the image of the poisoner persisted, shaped by political propaganda and artistic fascination. Inside the duchy, another narrative quietly took root, one defined by patience, resilience, and the gradual shaping of community. And within that quiet unfolding, Lucrezia Borgia moved further away from the role history had prematurely assigned to her, becoming instead a figure whose influence rested not on fear or spectacle, but on the steady practice of presence. By the 1510s, Lucrezia's life in Ferrara had settled into a steady rhythm. Her children were growing, the ducal household functioned like a well-organized mechanism, and her influence manifested not in dramatic political gestures but through consistent presence, careful management, and measured diplomacy. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, despite its political origins, had proven stable. Shared responsibilities in running the household, overseeing cultural life, and raising children created an atmosphere of cooperation and trust. Contemporary sources note that Lucrezia combined strictness with attention to detail, gradually earning respect at court. Ferrara itself differed from Rome: fewer ceremonies, a more orderly pace of life, less public pressure. Here, Lucrezia was able to gradually cultivate her own identity, distancing herself from the legend of the poisoner. Her role in cultural and public life became increasingly visible. She supported musicians, poets, and artists, oversaw literary gatherings, and took part in organizing festivals and intellectual salons. At the same time, her connection to Rome remained. News of Cesare Borgia's decline, the papal succession, and political upheavals continued to arrive by letters. Lucrezia followed her family's fortunes carefully, but she remained removed from direct conflict, understanding that her strength lay in stability and the ability to maintain order in Ferrara. Religious practice also assumed a greater place in her life. She attended Mass, supported monasteries and spiritual institutions, and corresponded with spiritual advisors. Sources indicate that this was not purely ceremonial. Lucrezia showed genuine concern and engagement in charitable work, which further reinforced her authority within the city. Motherhood remained central to her daily life. Despite the risks of pregnancy and the high mortality of infants, Lucrezia actively participated in the upbringing of her surviving children. She provided not only care but also an education, languages, literature, religious instruction, and courtly etiquette were part of her guidance. Outside Ferrara, rumors about Lucrezia's dark side continued to circulate, yet within the city her reputation was quite different: stable, intelligent, and composed. This combination of personal dignity and cultural involvement gradually shaped a legacy that historians would later compare with contemporary documentary evidence. In this way, the years in Ferrara became a period of quiet transformation. Lucrezia evolved from a figure surrounded by intrigue and rumor into an influential yet unobtrusive duchess, exercising power through culture, parenting, and careful diplomatic observation. As the 1510s progressed, Lucrezia's presence in Ferrara became increasingly central to the duchy's stability and cultural identity. Where her earlier life had been dominated by sudden political shifts, rumors, and forced marriages, she now exercised a quieter, more enduring form of influence. Alfonso d'Este continued to manage military and territorial matters, leaving the internal life of the court largely in Lucrezia's hands. She oversaw domestic administration, correspondence, and interactions with visiting dignitaries. Ambassadors' reports describe her as composed, attentive, and capable of balancing competing interests with tact, a skill that contrasted sharply with the sensationalized accounts circulating elsewhere about her alleged intrigues. Her patronage of the arts deepened. Lucrezia supported painters, musicians, and writers, contributing to Ferrara's reputation as a refined center of Renaissance culture. These efforts were not merely decorative. They strengthened the duchy's social cohesion, enhanced its prestige among other courts, and subtly demonstrated her own authority. Through such acts, she exercised influence without overt political maneuvering. Motherhood remained a defining aspect of her life. Her children, Ercole II, Ippolito II, Eleonora, and Francesco, received careful education and guidance, reflecting the same courtly ideals that had shaped Lucrezia herself. She modeled composure, patience, and the virtues of measured judgment, imparting both Borgia heritage and Este traditions to the next generation. At the same time, Lucrezia maintained connections with Rome and the broader political landscape. Letters from the city brought news of the papacy, family developments, and the ongoing struggles of her brother Cesare. While she no longer wielded direct influence there, she remained aware of how events in Italy could affect her position and the perception of her family. Religious life continued to occupy her attention. She engaged in charitable works, correspondence with spiritual advisors, and support for monasteries and convents. Such devotion reinforced both her personal identity and her public image, demonstrating a depth of character often overlooked by later sensationalist accounts. Despite her distance from Rome, the myths surrounding Lucrezia persisted. Stories of poison and intrigue continued to circulate in foreign courts, fueled by political rivalry and fascination with the Borgia name. Within Ferrara, however, those who interacted with her directly witnessed a different reality. A woman who exercised influence through patience, intellect, and careful management rather than through dramatic or violent means. By the end of the decade, Lucrezia had established herself as an essential figure in Ferrara. Her role was subtle but powerful, a testament to how Renaissance women could navigate complex political landscapes without resorting to the extremes later attributed to her. The contrast between legend and lived experience had never been sharper. Rumor painted her as a symbol of danger, while reality reflected stability, cultural engagement, and measured authority. The 1520s brought further challenges and responsibilities to Lucrezia's life in Ferrara. Alfonso d'Este remained focused on military and administrative affairs, often traveling to secure borders or oversee political negotiations. In his absences, Lucrezia's role expanded. She acted as de facto steward of the court, managing correspondence, mediating disputes among courtiers, and ensuring the smooth operation of the duchy's domestic and ceremonial functions. Observers noted her composure under pressure. Letters from foreign diplomats described her ability to maintain balance in the face of disagreements, her attentiveness to ceremony, and her skill in managing the expectations of visiting nobles. Where rumor suggested a woman capable of intrigue and malice, Ferrara witnessed a duchess whose influence rested on steadiness and prudence. Her cultural patronage continued to flourish. Musicians, poets, and scholars found support in her household. Lucrezia understood that the arts were not only expressions of beauty but instruments of diplomacy and social cohesion. By fostering intellectual and artistic life, she reinforced Ferrara's prestige and cultivated networks that extended beyond the duchy's borders. Motherhood remained central to her identity. Her children, guided by tutors and by her own example, received education in languages, history, the arts, and courtly behavior. Ercole, too, who would inherit the duchy, began to demonstrate early signs of leadership. Ippolito, too, showed aptitude for ecclesiastical life. Eleonora and Francesco were raised with attention to the social and political expectations of noble heirs. Lucrezia's careful oversight ensured that her children embodied both Borgia resilience and Este sophistication. Religious devotion remained intertwined with daily life. She participated in ceremonies, supported charitable initiatives, and maintained correspondence with spiritual advisors. These practices were both personal and public, reinforcing her image as a pious and thoughtful duchess. Despite her domestic stability, news from Rome continued to reach her. The decline of Cesare Borgia's fortunes and the political shifts of successive popes reminded her that the Borgia legacy remained fraught with tension. Letters from distant courts conveyed alliances, disputes, and occasional threats, illustrating the delicate balance required to maintain reputation and influence across Italy. Within Ferrara, however, the legend of the poisoner lost traction. Daily life, measured governance, and consistent presence gradually replaced rumor with lived reality. Those who met her in person observed intelligence, courtesy, and dignity. Her influence, exercised quietly yet effectively, demonstrated the power of persistence and tact in a world often dominated by spectacle and rumor. By the late 1520s and early 1530s, Lucrezia's identity in Ferrara had fully crystallized. No longer defined primarily as the daughter of Alexander VI or the widow of politically inconvenient marriages, she had become an integral part of the Este court's stability and cultural life. Her household reflected refinement, intellect, and order. Libraries and music rooms hosted gatherings of poets, scholars, and artists. Court ceremonies, carefully managed, reinforced hierarchy while allowing spaces for conversation and diplomacy. Through such activities, Lucrezia exercised influence indirectly, shaping opinion and loyalty without relying on overt authority or dramatic displays. The shadow of Rome persisted only in memory. Correspondence from distant relatives, reports of political maneuvering, and occasional whispers reminded her that the Borgia name carried history, scandal, and fascination. Yet within Ferrara, her lived reality diverged sharply from these stories. She was a duchess respected for steadiness, judgment, and cultural patronage. Motherhood continued to define her experience. Her children grew under her guidance, embodying both familial legacy and courtly sophistication. Each brought new responsibilities and new joys, as well as reminders of the fragility of life in a period where childhood mortality remained high. Lucrezia's attention to their education, manners, and relationships reflected the same careful cultivation she had applied to her own public and domestic role. Religious observance remained a pillar of her life. Charity, devotion, and careful attention to spiritual guidance anchored her daily routine. These acts also reinforced her public image, a duchess capable of balance between worldly responsibility and pious reflection. Reports from visiting diplomats continued to note the contrast between the myth of Lucrezia the poisoner and the woman they encountered. Composure, intelligence, patience, and measured judgment defined her character. In Ferrara, rumor yielded to observation, and legend was tempered by lived experience. Through the 1530s, Lucrezia's role expanded subtly yet significantly. While her husband negotiated alliances and managed the duchy's external relations, she increasingly took part in managing internal court life. Her presence mediated tensions, encouraged intellectual engagement, and cultivated loyalty. Where Rome had produced scandal and fear, Ferrara produced respect and stability. And so, the name Lucrezia Borgia, once synonymous with intrigue and poison in the imagination of Europe, came to represent something more complex and grounded, a woman who navigated power with care, cultivated culture with intention, and shaped the life of a duchy through persistence, patience, and steady presence. The 1530s brought both continuity and subtle change to Lucrezia's life in Ferrara. Alfonso X remained a central figure in political and military affairs, but age and the demands of governing increasingly drew on his energy. Lucrezia's role continued to grow, not through formal titles, but through presence, counsel, and management of the court's domestic and cultural life. Ferrara flourished as a hub of Renaissance art and intellect. Lucrezia encouraged artists, writers, and musicians, often commissioning works that celebrated the court and its achievements. These efforts were not merely aesthetic, they reinforced Ferrara's reputation among Italian courts, demonstrating sophistication, stability, and taste. In subtle ways, Lucrezia's patronage shaped cultural trends and ensured that Ferrara remained a center of influence. Her children matured under careful supervision. Ercole II, groomed to inherit the duchy, displayed the leadership qualities Lucrezia had worked to cultivate: intelligence, tact, and an awareness of courtly politics. Ippolito II pursued his ecclesiastical career, balancing personal ambition with family expectations. Eleonora, Francesco, and the younger children continued to embody the careful blending of Borgia daring and Este refinement. Correspondence with distant relatives and political figures reminded her of the fragile nature of power and reputation. Rome and other courts remained aware of the Borgia legacy, and while scandal was no longer an immediate concern, prudence was necessary. Through letters and reports, Lucrezia monitored the broader political landscape, ensuring that Ferrara remained respected and that her family's position remained secure. Even as her public influence grew, Lucrezia maintained a private devotion and attention to family life. Daily routines combined religious observance, charitable acts, supervision of her household, and guidance of her children. These responsibilities, though often unseen by outsiders, formed the backbone of her legacy in Ferrara, a life of steady governance, cultivated culture, and attentive family leadership. By the late 1530s, Lucrezia's identity as Duchess of Ferrara was firmly established. She had moved beyond the role of Borgia daughter, or scandalous widow, shaping instead a public image grounded in intellect, prudence, and patronage. Visitors to the court noted the contrast between myth and reality. Lucrezia was no longer a figure of intrigue, but a duchess whose influence was subtle, effective, and respected. Her cultural influence continued to shape Ferrara. Music, poetry, and art thrived under her patronage. Scholars found support, and ideas circulated freely in the court's salons. Through these activities, she fostered networks that reinforced Ferrara's prestige and extended the duchy's influence across Italy. Family remained central. Her children, now young adults, reflected her careful guidance. Ercole too prepared for succession, absorbing lessons in leadership and diplomacy. Ippolito too advanced within the church, guided by both ambition and family counsel. Eleonora and the others navigated marriage alliances and courtly expectations, supported by Lucrezia's wisdom and oversight. Despite her accomplishments, reminders of Rome and the Borgia name occasionally arrived. Letters from distant relatives, reports of political shifts, and whispers from other courts reminded her of her family's complicated history. Yet within Ferrara, these echoes of the past had little impact on her day-to-day influence. Stability, culture, and domestic governance defined her life more than rumor or scandal. Her religious devotion remained a cornerstone of daily life. Participation in ceremonies, charitable acts, and correspondence with spiritual advisors framed her responsibilities and reinforced her public image. She balanced the demands of power with personal piety, blending duty, intellect, and care. By the end of the 1530s, Lucrezia Borgia had transformed both her personal legacy and the perception of her name. No longer a cautionary tale of intrigue and poison, she had become a duchess admired for her steady hand, cultural vision, and thoughtful guidance of family and court. Her life in Ferrara illustrated the power of resilience, prudence, and quiet influence in a world often dominated by spectacle and rumor. By the mid-1510s, Lucrezia's role in Ferrara had solidified. She was no longer a newcomer watched with suspicion, but a duchess whose presence lent stability and dignity to the court. Her influence was subtle, exercised through example, through careful management of household and courtly affairs, and through cultural patronage that enhanced the Este reputation. Her relationship with Alfonso d'Este continued to be practical, rooted in mutual respect and the shared responsibilities of governance and family. Affection, though quiet, existed in small gestures, in shared oversight of their children, and in the careful attention each paid to the other's duties. Their marriage had become a partnership in the fullest sense of Renaissance expectations, where political calculation, survival, and household management were intertwined. Lucrezia's children were growing, and her guidance shaped their education and manners. Tutors instructed them in language, music, history, and literature, while Lucrezia reinforced values of composure, patience, and measured judgment. Through motherhood, she exercised authority that was both personal and enduring, contrasting with the temporary alliances and marriages that had marked her youth. The Borgia shadow, however, remained. News from Rome arrived slowly but consistently, keeping her aware of her family's changing fortunes. Cesare Borgia's campaigns, alliances, and eventual decline were reminders that her past was never fully separate from her present. Yet in Ferrara, her life followed a rhythm that emphasized continuity, culture, and the responsibilities of her household. She increasingly embraced religious devotion, not as dramatic display but as a private framework for reflection and moral guidance. Charitable acts, correspondence with spiritual advisors, and attendance at ceremonies reinforced her image as a thoughtful and measured duchess, countering the tales of scandal that had long surrounded her name. As visitors arrived from distant courts, they noted her elegance, intelligence, and composure. The rumors of poison and intrigue persisted elsewhere, but within Ferrara, Lucrezia's reputation was grounded in lived reality, a woman balancing her duties, motherhood, and patronage, crafting influence quietly but effectively. Her ability to navigate this balance reflected the lessons of her youth: observation, patience, and the knowledge that power could be exercised without spectacle. Ferrara became both refuge and stage, where Lucrezia could define herself on her own terms, even as the wider world continued to associate her with the myths of the Borgias. By the late 1510s, Lucrezia had entered her 40s, a period marked less by dramatic events than by the slow accumulation of authority and respect. The ducal court had grown accustomed to her presence, valuing her for the steadiness she brought to everyday governance, ceremonial life, and the cultural pursuits that shaped Ferrara's identity. Her children were now moving toward adolescence, and their futures became a focus of both pride and responsibility. Ercole II, Ippolito II, Eleonora, and Francesco were instructed not only in academic subjects, but also in the conduct expected of nobility. Lucrezia oversaw their education with care, instilling in them lessons of duty, composure, and negotiation that mirrored the skills she had cultivated throughout her own life. Cultural patronage remained central. Lucrezia supported artists, musicians, and writers, cultivating a court that valued intellect and beauty alongside politics. These activities extended her influence beyond the immediate household, connecting Ferrara to broader Italian networks of Renaissance thought and creativity. Visitors recorded her attentiveness to cultural life, noting that her presence encouraged discourse, reflection, and artistry rather than mere spectacle. The external Borgia narrative persisted, though now largely removed from daily reality. In Rome and other Italian courts, tales of intrigue, poison, and scandal continued to circulate, but they were increasingly disconnected from Lucrezia's lived experience. Within Ferrara, her reputation contrasted sharply with these stories, grounded in stability, discretion, and effective leadership. Religious devotion deepened as she aged, providing personal structure and moral grounding. Participation in charitable works, convent support, and correspondence with spiritual figures reflected a contemplative dimension to her life. These practices were consistent with Renaissance patterns for noblewomen, blending public duty with private reflection. Lucrezia's relationship with Alfonso had settled into a mature partnership. While romance was measured rather than dramatic, mutual respect and collaboration defined their household. Together they navigated both routine governance and the occasional political challenge, relying on practical judgment and shared experience rather than intrigue or spectacle. This period illustrates a clear divergence between legend and reality. Whereas popular imagination had long cast her as a symbol of danger and excess, her actual life demonstrated resilience, intelligence, and skillful navigation of courtly responsibilities. The Borgia myth continued, but in Ferrara, she had crafted a tangible, enduring legacy through stability, patronage, and family. In the early 1520s, Lucrezia's influence in Ferrara became increasingly subtle but profound. She moved seamlessly between private family life and the broader demands of courtly expectation, embodying both dignity and prudence. Her household operated with efficiency and grace, reflecting her understanding that power often lay in the management of details as much as in overt authority. Her children were now shaping their own identities, and Lucrezia carefully guided their formation, balancing instruction with freedom. She encouraged them to develop intellect, manners, and moral judgment, aware that their futures would carry the Este name into wider Italian and European circles. Each decision she made as a mother, over education, alliances, or ceremonial presence, was a reflection of her own hard-earned lessons in politics and reputation. Lucrezia's public role, though less sensational than her youth, remained significant. Visiting dignitaries and ambassadors noted her attentiveness, her cultivated taste, and her calm decisiveness. In conversations with foreign guests, she displayed an understanding of diplomacy tempered by personal insight, a stark contrast to the sensationalized image of her as a woman of intrigue and danger. The broader Italian political landscape, however, reminded her that caution was never optional. The shifting alliances of city-states, the ambitions of neighboring courts, and the fading power of the Borgias in Rome all shaped her awareness of the fragility of status. She navigated these waters carefully, ensuring Ferrara maintained its position while shielding her household from unnecessary controversy. Her religious devotion deepened in both private and public dimensions. She participated in charitable works, patronized convents, and corresponded with spiritual advisors, blending personal faith with social responsibility. This devotion reinforced her image as a stabilizing figure in Ferrara, someone whose moral and cultural influence extended beyond the immediate family. Through these years, Lucrezia increasingly defined herself not by her infamous past but by tangible contributions to the court and her children. Her life exemplified a Renaissance ideal: intelligence, elegance, and prudence exercised with quiet authority. While rumors of poison or scandal lingered elsewhere, in Ferrara, she was recognized for the concrete reality of leadership, culture, and maternal guidance. By the mid-1520s, Lucrezia's children were entering adolescence, and their emerging personalities reflected her careful influence. She balanced encouragement with discipline, guiding them toward the virtues of composure, intellect, and social grace necessary for their future roles in Italian courts. Her focus on education extended to language, history, music, and literature, as well as the ethical and political wisdom she had cultivated through her own experiences. Lucrezia's presence in Ferrara continued to shape the cultural landscape. She remained a patron of the arts, commissioning works that celebrated the Este court while reflecting her own tastes. Her support extended beyond mere display, fostering intellectual discourse and encouraging young artists and thinkers to engage with courtly life. Ferrara, under her influence, became a center where culture, refinement, and politics intertwined. Despite her domestic focus, she never lost sight of the broader political context. The decline of the Borgias in Rome served as a reminder that reputation, alliances, and prudence were vital. Lucrezia skillfully maintained distance from scandal, using discretion and judgment to protect her family's standing while carefully nurturing relationships with other noble families. Her relationship with Alfonso remained steady. Affection was understated, expressed in cooperation, shared responsibilities, and mutual respect. Together they navigated challenges, both political and personal, with the experience of two individuals who understood the intricacies of Renaissance courtly life. Their marriage, once a political arrangement, had matured into a functional and harmonious partnership. Religious devotion and charitable work remained central to Lucrezia's life. Her engagement with spiritual advisors, acts of philanthropy, and attendance at ceremonies strengthened both her personal faith and her public image. In doing so, she demonstrated that moral authority and cultural leadership were inseparable from her role as a duchess and mother. By now, Lucrezia had firmly established herself as a figure of dignity, intelligence, and discretion. Her past, marked by scandal, intrigue, and the turbulence of the Borgia name, was receding into legend. In Ferrara, she was remembered not as a symbol of danger but as a stabilizing, influential, and cultured duchess whose legacy would endure through her children and the court she helped shape. By the late 1520s, Lucrezia Borgia's life in Ferrara had settled into a rhythm of measured influence. Though no longer the subject of scandalous rumors in the city, her presence carried authority in subtle but tangible ways. She had learned the value of discretion, of shaping events without overtly asserting control, a lesson honed in her youth amidst the turbulence of the Borgia name. Her children were growing into young adults, each reflecting aspects of her guidance. She continued to cultivate their intellect, social grace, and sense of duty, understanding that they would carry the Este legacy forward. She took pride in their accomplishments, yet tempered her involvement to allow them to develop independence, aware that excessive control could undermine their confidence. Cultural patronage remained a hallmark of Lucrezia's life. She commissioned artworks, encouraged literary discussion, and maintained correspondence with thinkers beyond Ferrara. Her taste influenced not only the court's aesthetic but also its intellectual life. Visitors often remarked on the harmony between her cultivated household and the broader sophistication of the Este court, recognizing her role in shaping this environment. Politics, while less immediate than in her Roman years, remained a careful consideration. The shifting alliances of Italian city-states required ongoing vigilance. Lucrezia advised Alfonso quietly, often mediating between factions, and ensured that Ferrara avoided entanglement in unnecessary disputes. Her reputation for prudence and clarity in judgment enhanced the duchy's stability. Private devotion and charitable work remained central to her identity. Lucrezia's patronage of convents, support for the poor, and personal piety were expressions of both faith and social responsibility. These acts reinforced her role as a moral and cultural anchor within Ferrara, contrasting with the more sensational aspects of her early reputation. As the 1530s approached, Lucrezia's influence in Ferrara was increasingly defined by continuity and legacy. She had outlived much of the political turbulence that had once threatened her family and herself. In her measured actions, she demonstrated that intelligence, foresight, and discretion could secure respect more reliably than notoriety or force. Her children were stepping into roles that required both social skill and political awareness. Lucrezia guided them subtly, offering counsel while allowing them to face challenges directly, knowing that experience was the ultimate teacher. Her maternal wisdom shaped their understanding of power, loyalty, and the importance of measured judgment. Within the court, Lucrezia's tastes and decisions continued to influence Ferrara's cultural landscape. Art, music, and literature thrived under her patronage. She sought works that reflected moral virtue, intellectual curiosity, and aesthetic refinement, reinforcing her own values and those of her household. The Este court, in turn, became renowned for its sophistication, largely due to her careful guidance. In social matters, Lucrezia maintained a balance between visibility and discretion. Her interactions with other noble families, visiting dignitaries, and court officials demonstrated courtesy, intelligence, and emotional control. She had mastered the art of influence without overt assertion, ensuring that Ferrara remained respected and secure. Religion remained a guiding force in her life. Lucrezia's devotion was reflected in her charitable works, attendance at ceremonies, and consultation with spiritual advisors. These acts were both personal and public, reinforcing her moral authority and contributing to the duchy's cultural and ethical framework. By this period, Lucrezia had redefined her legacy. Once infamous as the daughter of the Borgia family, she was now remembered in Ferrara as a cultured, wise, and stabilizing figure. Her life demonstrated the power of prudence, intellect, and personal integrity in shaping both family and courtly legacy. By the mid-1530s, Lucrezia's presence in Ferrara was synonymous with refinement and stability. She had transitioned fully from the center of political turbulence to a position of cultural and familial authority. Her guidance shaped not only her children but also the broader court, influencing diplomatic etiquette, artistic commissions, and the social conduct expected within noble circles. Her correspondence with other European courts continued, revealing a mind keenly aware of political currents. Though she avoided direct involvement in conflicts, her advice and insight were valued by those seeking to navigate the shifting alliances of the Italian states. In this way, Lucrezia maintained a quiet but meaningful influence over events beyond Ferrara's walls. Family remained her greatest focus. She observed her children's marriages and alliances, understanding their importance for securing the Este legacy. Lucrezia balanced her protective instincts with recognition of their independence, ensuring that guidance did not become interference. Her maternal diplomacy shaped her children's ability to engage confidently in public and political life. Cultural patronage remained a cornerstone of her identity. She continued to commission works of art, literature, and music, often selecting projects that emphasized moral virtue, intellectual sophistication, and social decorum. These efforts reinforced Ferrara's reputation as a center of refinement and positioned Lucrezia as a tastemaker whose judgment commanded respect. In her personal life, Lucrezia emphasized stability, devotion, and measured pleasure. The drama of her earlier years had given way to a quieter, more contemplative existence, one that allowed her to cultivate both her own intellect and the talents of those around her. Her life now exemplified how grace, wisdom, and discretion could transform legacy. As the late 1530s approached, Lucrezia increasingly reflected on her life and legacy. The storms of her youth, the political machinations, family scandals, and rumors, had faded into memory, replaced by the enduring work of fostering culture, morality, and stability. Her reputation, once fraught with suspicion, was now marked by respect and admiration. Her children were coming of age, taking on public responsibilities, and securing alliances that strengthened the Este position in Italy and beyond. Lucrezia's influence in shaping their judgment, taste, and diplomacy became evident, as each reflected aspects of her guidance and temperament. She recognized the success of her efforts in their confidence, poise, and ability to navigate complex social networks. Lucrezia's role as a patron of the arts deepened. She commissioned works that celebrated virtue, learning, and the humanist ideals of the period, ensuring that Ferrara remained a hub of intellectual and aesthetic achievement. Scholars, artists, and musicians flourished under her attention, drawn by both her discernment and her support. In diplomacy and courtly life, she exercised subtle authority. Lucrezia's reputation for clarity, prudence, and moral integrity made her a trusted intermediary in delicate situations. Her counsel helped maintain Ferrara's stability amid shifting alliances and occasional tensions, reflecting a lifetime of learning how influence could be wielded wisely and discreetly. By the end of this decade, Lucrezia had transformed her life's narrative. From a figure embroiled in scandal and intrigue, she became a symbol of cultivated elegance, maternal wisdom, and strategic discretion. Her legacy was no longer defined by rumor but by the enduring impact of her guidance, taste, and moral example. The 1540s saw Lucrezia Este's influence firmly rooted in Ferrara. Her court had become a model of refinement, diplomacy, and learning. She was respected not only as a matriarch but also as a cultural leader whose taste and judgment shaped the city's identity. Lucrezia's children, now adults, carried forward her principles. Their marriages and alliances reflected careful planning, and their conduct mirrored her emphasis on discretion, courtesy, and moral responsibility. Lucrezia's quiet oversight ensured that the Este name remained associated with wisdom, culture, and political acumen. In the arts, Lucrezia continued to sponsor works that reflected humanist ideals. Her patronage nurtured writers, painters, and musicians whose contributions strengthened Ferrara's reputation across Italy. She understood that culture was a form of soft power, capable of influencing perception and maintaining prestige. Despite her prominence, Lucrezia maintained personal humility. She avoided ostentation, preferring subtle gestures of generosity and thoughtful engagement over public displays. Her leadership was thus both effective and admired, demonstrating how influence could be exercised without arrogance or excess. As Lucrezia approached the final years of her life, her reflections were both personal and historical. She had witnessed immense change, the rise and fall of rulers, shifting political alliances, and transformations in art and thought. Through it all, she had navigated challenges with care, ensuring her family's survival and prominence while cultivating a legacy of culture and virtue. Her health began to decline, but her mind remained sharp. She continued to advise her children and oversee cultural projects, emphasizing the enduring value of education, taste, and measured judgment. Letters from distant courts and scholars arrived regularly, underscoring the respect she commanded far beyond Ferrara. Lucrezia also invested in the city itself. Charitable works, support for learning institutions, and the commissioning of public art ensured that her influence would be felt long after her lifetime. Her vision for Ferrara was one in which culture, morality, and stability were intertwined, creating a lasting foundation for future generations. Lucrezia Este passed away quietly, leaving behind a legacy shaped by prudence, wisdom, and cultural patronage. Where once rumors and scandal had marked her early life, she now stood as a model of cultivated elegance and maternal guidance. Her children, allies, and the citizens of Ferrara remembered her not for controversy, but for her enduring contributions to family, art, and society. Her life demonstrated the power of resilience, discretion, and thoughtful influence. Through careful navigation of politics, personal relationships, and cultural initiatives, Lucrezia transformed potential adversity into opportunity, ensuring that her name would be remembered with respect and admiration. In history, Lucrezia Este represents the convergence of intellect, taste, and moral courage, an example of how a life once overshadowed by scandal can evolve into one defined by legacy, guidance, and enduring cultural impact.